Welcome, everyone, to today's webinar on going multi-site. We're really excited to share some of the best practices that we've learned with you about launching your first campus and avoiding the common and honestly often very costly mistakes that multi-site churches are always telling us that they regret making. But before we get into the content today, I want to introduce the panelists that are here with me. First of all, Tony Morgan. Tony, if you don't know Tony, is the founder and lead strategist here at the Unstuck Group. Started back in 2009, the Unstuck Group has now served more than 650 churches throughout the United States and several other countries around the world. And Tony, I know you have some personal experience with launching campuses. You have a quick story that comes to mind? Should you think about your multi-site journey?
Yeah. So, obviously in recent years, our team has served a lot of multi-site churches, and we're going to talk more about that in a moment. But my very first experience with multi-site was actually back, must have been about 2007, 2008, almost right before I launched the Unstuck Group. And I was at New Spring Church in South Carolina and helping the team there launch the very first location in Greenville, South Carolina. And it's funny, as we dive into today's conversation about launching your first multi-site, I've had some of those emotions coming back to me from that very first launch that we did at New Spring. As you might imagine, lots of anticipation, lots of excitement. And then also with that, though, is got a little bit of PTSD, just to be honest, because it takes so much work. There are so many details. And as we've learned through the years, there's just a right way to do multi-site, and there's some challenges if you don't get the strategy right. And since this is my first time doing that and our team's first time doing that, going into it again, we were excited, but we were also just wondering, is this really going to work? And so it worked, by the way, and has continued to work for New Spring through the years. But I certainly learned a lot through that experience. And I don't doubt that a lot of that experience from that very first launch has crept into our multi-site process at the Unstuck Group as well. But that was a fun season for sure.
Yeah. I'm guessing churches who are tuned in today, at least some of them are feeling some of those anxieties also. Yeah. So they probably relate. We also have our teammate, Amy Anderson, joining us today. Amy has served as the Director of Consulting here at the Unstuck Group since 2009. And she's served well over 150 churches in that time, helping them design ministry, staffing, and definitely multi-site strategies that align and fuel their mission. Amy, you have a history of launching campuses as well. Any stories come to mind for you?
Yeah, well, similar to Tony, my front row seat was going from one location to two at my home church. And Tony, similar, I think ours was back in 2006. And you talk about being worried about everything. I actually wasn't, because I was leading the weekend, and I guess I must not have been very much a team player, because all I had to do was worry about the weekend. It never occurred to me about kids, volunteer, like all the things, all the other ministry areas had to figure out. And we did okay with our first launch, but there was so much unknown about multi-site at that point. So needless to say, we got a lot smarter when we launched our third location and fourth. But the good news, I think, for people watching this webinar today is that we have learned so much about launching multi-site locations over the past 2 decades. And there are definitely proven strategies that set a church up for a successful launch now. But I'm sorry you have PTSD, Tony. I just have excitement for all these churches.
So, Amy, I wonder if you just share a little bit about why we chose this topic for right now. Why is this the right conversation for today?
Sure. Well, again, I'm so glad we're having the conversation. I think when we went through COVID, we wondered, wow, will anyone go multi-site again? But it's happening. The Unstuck Church Report, Tony, the data you've pulled. I think the first time we do anything causes us anxiety. Anything in life, but launching another location of your church is no exception to that anxiety. After all, for our participants, if you've never led through this before, you probably have a healthy sense of, we don't know what we don't know. And I'm sure if you Google multi-site church, there's lots of information out there. But honestly, I don't think it's all that helpful. It's one of the reasons we created our multi-site offering, is because there was so much information out there, but it never played the movie forward to say, and how does that strategy work? And how did that one play out? So while you're probably doing, to our participants, all that you can, researching multi-site strategies, maybe visiting other multi-site churches, you still might not be confident that you can do this without creating some chaos in what's most likely a very healthy church right now. And it's true, if you go multi-site, too fast, if you go too soon, or if you don't have the right strategies in place, your church will most likely get multi-stuck, as we like to call it.
Yeah, that's right, Amy. But we've learned there is a way to harness the momentum that you're experiencing as a ministry and then replicate that for continued health and growth without breaking what's working now. You can do this. In fact, our team has more than 100 combined years of experience leading thriving multi-site churches, including large, very large, healthy, growing churches that have embarked on multi-site for the very first time. So we can show you what we've found really does work. And these strategies do over time they've proven that they really do work. Ironically, it seemed like the multi-site was losing momentum during the pandemic. Amy, you referenced this. There were some prominent multi-site churches that were unmulti-siting during that season, and no one was growing. So expansion really wasn't on anyone's mind, certainly not through adding additional locations. And I heard a lot of pastors speculating that maybe multi-site was in decline. But in the last 12 months, we've had more churches reaching out to us about help with launching campuses than we've ever had before in the history of the Unstuck Group. And that's also, Amy, as you mentioned, reflected in the data we've been collecting recently, which is showing more and more churches are considering going multi-site. So we firmly believe multi-site can help a growing church leverage its momentum to reach more people with the love of Jesus. And that's really why we're doing this webinar today.
Yeah, that's so true. And if that's you, if you're a church that's considering it, we're really want to encourage you to make a specific decision today. And here's what we'll be pushing for. We want you to commit to reviewing the predictable outcomes you learn today with your senior leadership team before you move forward. And we're going to equip you in the conversation today to do that. We want to help you get clarity on the how, when, and who for going multi-site for the very first time. And we're going to walk through that approach in 3 different sequential steps. First of all, we want to help you learn the predictable outcomes of multi-site before you decide on your model. Secondly, we want to help you accurately assess if you're ready for multi-site. And then lastly, we want to help you identify the key staffing and structure decisions that you'll need to make for multi-site. So we'll go through those 3 steps today. Before we get into that part of the conversation, though, just a few last things for our webinar. We'll have chat and live Q&A going on during the webinar today. In chat, you can make comments, even submit questions to one another. In the live Q&A, you can submit questions to our team. And so just use those functions within Zoom, and that'll work and help us keep the questions evened out. We'll also have a companion workbook for today. If you go to the unstuckgroup.com/workbook, you can download it there. Our team is going to be interacting in chat today with you and helping to identify some questions to cover at the end of the live Q&A that will benefit the most people. At the end of the webinar in the live Q&A that'll benefit the most people. And then as we go through the conversation today, if you'd like to share any of your thoughts or questions on social media, you can do that using the hashtag UnstuckChurch. Again, hashtag UnstuckChurch. So let's get into part 1 here, the predictable outcomes of multi-site. If you search online for the best practices for leading a multi-site church, you probably easily get a sense that there are a lot of different ways to do multi-site effectively. However, we found that that's not exactly the case. So Tony, will you kick off this part of the conversation by sharing what we've learned over time?
Yeah. So, we've talked about this in the past, but it's amazing how many parallels there are between multi-site strategy in churches and, frankly, how we parent our children. Mm-hmm. And as you know, for any of you that have children, you got to love them, but sometimes we feel like we're parenting the same way, but kids grow up differently. And then we watch other people parent their kids, And then and through that, we realized, gosh, there are multiple different ways to parent our children, but not all of those strategies are maybe the healthiest ways of parenting our kids. And not all of those parenting strategies then lead to healthy, thriving young adults. By the same token, churches, we have found through the years, have tried many, many different ways to do multi-site. Some of those strategies over time have produced healthy, thriving churches where it really is one church and many locations. And on the other hand, we've seen churches approach multi-site in ways that the strategies did not work. But unfortunately, they pursued that path, maybe because folks like me in the past have said, there are many ways to do multi-site. Just pick one, pick the right one for you. But what we have found over time is not all of those multi-site strategies end up producing healthy, thriving multi-site churches. So let me give you two examples. Whenever I speak highly of a ministry, you'll notice I like to brag on them by name. And so first example, I want to brag on Sun Valley Community Church in Phoenix. Now, I think I want to say they're in 6 locations. It's 5 or 6, I think. And the church, it's been fun to come alongside them at different times through the years because they get it. They get it. They understand this is who we are. This is how we're reaching people for Jesus. This is how we're helping people take their next steps towards Christ. And rather than trying to do something different in different locations, trying to reach different people, they've just decided we're going to do what we've seen God bless through our ministry in the past. And we're going to replicate who we are, the strength of what we do as a ministry in as many locations as we can to reach as many people as we can. And it was fascinating, even through the pandemic and certainly coming out of the pandemic, because of that just ongoing commitment to a strategy, ministry strategy that's working for Sun Valley to accomplish its mission. They're seeing continued growth in the church. They just recently just added another location. They're seeing many, many, many people come to Christ and get baptized. And so that's when churches get multi-site right, that's a picture of what it can look like. On the other hand, there was a church that we worked with. Amy and I worked with this church a number of years ago. Again, it was one, they indicated up front, one church in multiple locations, and they had many locations, but they were not one church. And we started to get into it, and you could see they were using a multi-site strategy that wasn't focused on unity. It wasn't focused on replicating a strategy that was working at their original location. They were completely focused on what needed to be different in each of their different campuses. And I just jumped on their website in recent weeks and found out they had to close half of their multi-site locations because of some of the challenges they were seeing through their multi-site strategy. Mm-hmm. So the key is being aware of those different outcomes up front so that your team can first get clear on where you're really trying to end up, and then to pick the approach most likely to lead you to that destination. For multi-site to really work, everyone has to be on the same page about why the church is engaging this strategy, and then importantly, how the church is going to engage this multi-site strategy.
Let's drill down on a few of those predictable outcomes that we've seen proved time and time again. And Amy, I want to start with you. What are the predictable outcomes of the different approaches to teaching in a multi-site church?
Hey, well, you're going to throw the most controversial one at me right away.
That's right. Let's
and
start
maybe
there.
The most important one, Tony, as you were just talking about, for multi-site to work, you have to define like what you want for that outcome first. And by the way, now I have PTSD as you're talking about that church we served. That was really a hard one because
it was
a hard one. But teaching, how you decide to do the teaching in your multi-site model really does have a predictable outcome depending on what you decide. So one of the most fundamental decisions within a multi-site strategy is the teaching model, because this decision impacts the overall multi-site ministry model in so many ways. So for instance, how you decide to handle the teaching, whether you're choosing an identical model or one with more autonomy. That's going to determine how vision and culture will be established at each campus. It's going to define what kind of campus leader, campus pastor, and campus staff that you need to hire. It certainly will inform how you structure your team and how you support those ministry strategies. So how does your teaching model relate to an impact, vision, and culture? Let's go into that one first. Well, Tony, you say this a lot. Like it or not, whoever does the most talking from the stage in a church sets the culture, intentionally or by neglect. So if you go highly identical, that culture is going to translate very well because we're getting a consistent person from stage. But when we go autonomous, where we have different people teaching on different stages, different cultures are going to evolve over time. You can count on it. In fact, that church you were referencing, that's how we knew they weren't one church. We experienced the different cultures that each of those pastors were creating. So if you want the best opportunity to have one vision and one culture, video teaching is the stronger choice for that outcome. And by the way, that doesn't have to be an emotionally charged realization. It's simply a predictable outcome that you have to wrestle with when you're deciding how you believe God's calling you to reach more people. And here's what we know. When it comes to the strategies for church planting, which I call that autonomous site and multi-site, both of them work, but you have to lean the right way when you're setting your strategies. And again, I said video teaching is on that identical side. Multi-site in general needs to lean towards those identical strategies. And then church planting needs to lean more towards those autonomous strategies, things that you're going to adapt to the different contexts. And here's what we know. If you try to live in the middle, trying to be just a little bit identical and a little bit autonomous, it rarely, I almost want to say never, but I'll just say it rarely works. And before we leave this topic on the teaching side of things, we believe having a teaching team is healthy for both single location churches and for multi-site churches. I hear a lot, Tony, when I do staffing and structure, so many pastors these days, they say things like, I don't want to be a celebrity pastor. We don't want to be a celebrity church. I think there's just a lot of residue with the things that have happened in our church world the past decade. But having a teaching team is a great strategy for both single and multi-site locations because it brings, number one, it brings diversity to your platform, giving you a broader reach into the congregation. If you just have one voice, you're going to reach some, but when you have some diversity on the team, I think it broadens that reach into the congregation. I also think it communicates that more than one person can hear from the Lord and can teach the word. And I think this is a big one for me as a leader over the weekend. I think it gives teachers more time to develop their content and increase the creativity in their messages. So with teaching teams, I actually think the teaching improves over time. And then the last thing I'll just add is that the data shows that multi-site churches that embrace this identical ministry model, which includes the teaching, Tony, I think you said they grow twice as fast as churches that lean more autonomous, multi-site churches that lean more autonomous. And, we suspected that for years, but the data you collected I think it was quarter 4 for the Unstuck Church report, it really confirmed all those things that we had been sensing over the years.
Yeah, Amy, as you're talking about all of that, this is how I've seen this play out a number of times when churches are considering going multi-site for the very first time. It's the biggest topic that rises to the top in the conversation before launching the first location. And I've seen a lot of churches actually start to ask people, would you prefer to watch the teaching on video or prefer to have a live teacher in the room? And the reality is, if you ask someone that question, they're always going to say, well, we prefer to see the person in the room teaching. But here's the reality is if your strategy is ultimately to have multiple locations, I'm just going to say this bluntly. If let's say you're in 4 locations, there's 4 different teachers at those 4 locations. The reality is one of those teachers is the strongest Bible teacher communicator that you have. In that group of 4 teachers too is also the 4th worst or the worst teacher, the 4th best teacher on the team. And so if you were to ask people before you launch your first location, what do you want to hear our 4th best teacher live Or would you prefer to hear every Sunday our best teacher on video? If you ask the question that way, most people would say we would prefer to see the message on video. And so it's just that perspective of you have to think longer term with this decision. You have to consider in order for us to continue to reach more and more people, which is going to require us to multiply locations, if we could have a strong teaching team, as Amy just alluded to, where the message is delivered by video so that every Sunday, every location's hearing from our best teacher on that Sunday, I think you'll find over time that your church is actually going to appreciate that, and you're going to avoid a lot of challenges that we've seen churches run into when multiple voices end up developing multiple cultures.
That's really good, Tony. And the truth is, the other thing I've noticed is that most churches that are large enough to be multi-site, if you're sitting in their worship center for the message, you're probably looking at the side of the room for a screen anyways.
Everybody's watching the message on video.
That's right. That's right. So Tony, what's another predictable outcome that comes to mind that you think just is commonly misunderstood or underestimated?
Yeah. So the next predictable outcome is you replicate what you already are. And again, so many parallels to parenting. One of my kids said something in the last couple of days, and I'm thinking, oh my goodness, train up a child in the way they should go. And it was one of those things like, it was an ouch for me because I was thinking, why did you say that? And then I thought, oh my goodness, I think I've said that. So you replicate what you are, and multi-site. It's just because of that. It's not a solution for reaching totally different people in a totally different community. If that's your goal, I would encourage you to plant a new church. And church planting is a great strategy. I have had a number of my friends in ministry that have been church planters, and through that strategy, they've reached thousands of people for Jesus. But if your goal is to reach different people in different communities, multi-site is not the strategy to use. If you're trying to reach people that are a reflection of who you're trying to reach as a church in as many communities as possible, multi-site is the way to go. So the big question is, do you have a healthy culture and a strategy worth replicating? Because both the healthy and the unhealthy things about who you are as a ministry will be replicated. We've seen it happen time and time again. Churches that focus on what will be distinctive or different at a new multi-site location, they tend to struggle with their multi-site strategy, versus churches that focus on what must be in common or what must be completely aligned. Those churches tend to succeed with multi-site strategy. And by the way, we could look outside the church and see the same example. Successful businesses, they're asking the question, how can we sell our same products or services in new locations? Mm-hmm. Successful churches, on the other hand, sometimes take the opposite approach. And they ask this type of a question. We are a healthy, thriving church in one location. So what needs to be different in a new location? What's going to be distinctive about the people we're trying to reach? How do our strategies need to change? How does the worship need to change? How does the teaching need to change? How does our discipleship strategy need to change? By the way, that's the way church planters think. And that is a good strategy for church planting. But it's not the way that pastors at healthy multi-site churches think. Pastors at healthy multi-site churches think more like successful business leaders, in that these pastors know that they're making a huge impact in people's lives, and their current approach to accomplishing that mission, to engaging the gospel mission that God's called them to, they're thinking, how can I take our same product, if you will, our same strategy, and reach more people for Jesus in a new location? So they're always thinking about alignment, unity, engaging the same strategies that are working in their current location and trying to replicate that in a new location.
So, Amy, as we close out this part of the conversation today, do you have any final thoughts?
Yeah, let me just step back to the teaching again. 2 thoughts. Tony, I liked what you added on. I want to add that when you launch your first multi-site, it may feel like you can do live teaching in 2 locations. So Tony, I appreciated thinking through when we have 4. The other thing I would add is it's hard to step back from a live teaching decision. Meaning once you launch campuses with live teaching and then you realize, ooh, this isn't working, like many churches before you have, it's hard to step back. So I just want to reinforce the pause. And the other thing I'd want to encourage you around is try not to convince yourself that you're going to be the exception to the rule. When you think about your multi-site church, don't let that exception to the rule thinking guide you when you're deciding on your teaching approach. There are 1 or 2 churches that I know of that over a significant amount of time have done live teaching at locations and remained one church. Tony, I think the best example is Community Christian Church, Dave Ferguson's church. But their success, and maybe the 1 or 2 others, is due to some significant uniqueness in the leaders of those churches. So we are decades again into this multi-site movement. The data is there now to help you make the decision that is most likely going to help lead to the destination that you want with your multi-site model.
So we've actually listed out all 9 of the predictable outcomes that we've seen and that we teach about in our multi-site consulting process on the very last page of the workbook. So you can take this back to your leadership team for discussion together. We just want to give you about 20 seconds, and I just want to invite you to skim through that list and actually put a star by any of the predictable outcomes that you intuitively know are going to require some healthy debate on your team. So let's take 20 seconds and do that now. All right, let's move on to the second part of today's conversation, how to know if you're ready for multi-site. All the unknowns around going multi-site can really create some anxiety for churches and church leaders. And a big part of that is not being 100% sure that you're really ready to do this or even how to evaluate that. Tony, I wonder, will you spend a few minutes talking about the different scenarios that we see when a church goes multi-site before they really are truly ready?
Yeah, so especially for healthy, thriving, growing churches, the day will come when a church will reach out to you, or maybe a denominational leader will reach out to you, and they're going to ask if you would be open to a merger. But my strong encouragement would be that you pause any merger conversations until you take a hard look at establishing what your multi-site strategy is going to look like going forward. And I say that, again, it's just, just put ourselves back in the dating world here for a moment. I try to forget that. Fortunately, I met my wife, Emily, when we were in middle school. She actually asked me out on our first date when we were in high school, and then we got married after college. So I can't imagine what this is like. We've watched our kids go through this process. And of course, coaching, especially for our girls, has been just because a guy asks you out on a date doesn't mean you should marry him. And I would give you the same advice as pastors. Just because a church contacts you to consider a potential merger doesn't mean you should follow through with a marriage or a merger in this case. And please make sure you have a defined multi-site strategy before you pursue a merger. Another consideration here is they have attendance growth to warrant expansion, but they're not prepared to fund the new campus until it's self-sustaining, which is often maybe up to 3 years. And so you have to make sure financially you're prepared to take that step. Another consideration is they start down the path without having a deep leadership bench, or they don't have the staff to be able to support multiple locations because the staff is already stretched too thin. Another consideration is they try to launch too fast. You can launch a new service in a couple of months, but you can't launch a healthy church in a couple of months. And that's essentially what you're trying to do when you launch a new multi-site location. So because of that, if this is the first time you're launching a multi-site location, we recommend building a plan and then working that plan for, it's probably going to take you 18 to 24 months before you launch your first multi-site campus. Now, for multi-site churches that are opening their third or fourth location, or maybe more, that window can be shortened, maybe even down to 12 to 15 months, depending on whether or not you're starting in a portable location. And I was going to share a story of a church that tried to merge before they had a multi-site strategy. They tried to launch before they were financially ready. They tried to open a campus before they had developed their leadership bench, or tried to launch a location too fast. But just to be honest, there are so many examples of all of those scenarios. It was just hard for me to pick one church. And so you have to make sure that all of these considerations have been addressed with your team before you take the step of merging with another church. And here's what's so frustrating about all of this. When the new campus fails to take off or needs to be closed, too many times I've heard leaders say things like this: well, I guess multi-site doesn't work here. So let me be clear. Multi-site is working all through the US. Churches in Canada are using multi-site, churches in the UK. I can give you hundreds of examples of healthy, thriving multi-site churches in urban locations, suburbs, rural contexts. There are thousands of multi-site churches that are growing and reaching more people for Jesus. Multi-site works. It's your approach to multi-site strategy, or a lack thereof, that did not work. And it's funny, years ago, we were driving down the highway, and we were, I was in ministry helping other churches. And Emily, my wife, said, Tony, why don't churches just call? Because you can see it. You know it's going to be a mistake. They should put billboards on the highways, she said, that say 1-800-ASK-TONY. And I kind of want to, especially here, it's like, I want you to be a church that can consider mergers in the future, but you need to have a healthy multi-site strategy first, so that you can avoid some of these mistakes that we've seen churches make in the past.
That's good. And the good news, they can call us, but since it's 2024, it's easier if they just get on our website and contact us that way. So they can still get help.
That's right.
All right, let's share some of our secrets for helping a church know if they're ready to go multi-site. Amy, can you just share a high-level overview of the multi-site readiness checkpoints tool from our consulting process?
Yeah, we'll pull this up so our participants can see it. But these are 10 readiness checkpoints that when a church is getting ready to go multi-site, that we work through in our engagement. And so you can read all 10 there. But as we go through each one with the church, we'll actually walk through, like, what are some evidences of health in this area? And then we have them rate, are they red in this area? Are they yellow or green? So of course, green means we're not perfect, but we're pretty strong there. Yellow, some health, some non-health. And of course, red means, pay attention to this one. We don't have health in that area yet. So let me just walk through a couple of them, for example, and I'm just going to get my document here. So when we look at, for instance, volunteer strength, the 6th checkpoint there, when we're talking through that, we aren't just saying, do we have volunteers for the new location? We're actually looking at our volunteer culture overall, because new campus launches require a deeper bench with volunteers. You not only need a lot of people who are volunteering in kind of those doer roles, right? The ushers, the greeters, serving in our kids' rooms, but you also need high-level volunteers that can actually lead those volunteers. That's the key to developing the team at a multi-site church. So we're going to look at vital signs with the church. That's one of the assessments that we run our multi-site churches through, or people who are looking to go multi-site. And we're looking at, do they have at least 50% of their congregation currently engaged in serving? And the second data point we look at is their volunteer leader ratio. The benchmark for that is that you have one volunteer leader, someone who's leading other people, for every 10 people that attend your church. And then, of course, the healthiest ones, Tony, I think, is 1 to 5, that you've got one volunteer leader for every 5 people that attend your church. So, and I call that one out because that volunteer strength is a big one. When you launch a new campus, you not only need the volunteers for that new location, you also need the volunteers at your current location. So we'll have a great conversation just to talk through how are we doing in that area. And this one, as well as staff leadership capacity, are often ones that are tipping towards that red mark, especially right now coming, post pandemic. People are back at church, but as we've talked about in the podcast a lot, those volunteer numbers, they've struggled to climb back up and recover as fast as some of the other areas. Then the other one I would call out is define systems and strategies. So we often talk about, Tony, you said earlier, you can't replicate. You replicate who you are. That is true. But if you want to replicate your ministry strategies, you can't replicate things that aren't defined. So we often call this church in a box, or moving from the oral tradition of how you do your ministry to the written tradition of how you're going to do your ministry, so that everybody at the new campus understands this is how we do, for instance, the weekend services, or this is how we do guest services. This is how we do kids ministry. This is how we do student ministries. Writing that down, it creates a safety net that everyone kind of understands these are our ministry strategies. So for me, for example, over the weekend at my home church, it was really important that, different people were now going to be leading our weekend experience, and I can't be in all locations at once. And so we had to come up with the right words to create the right picture of what we were expecting out of those weekend services. So it's not only the ministry areas, but I'd also add those kind of central support areas. How do we handle a campus budget? Have we written that down? How do we handle money? How do we, integrate with HR back at the sending campus? So all those central system support also needs to be documented, so campus staff understand how they communicate and work with those other areas. So anyways, going through this, I encourage you to kind of walk through each of these and ask yourself, are we red? Are we yellow? Are we green? And we often say if we're red, we're dead, meaning we aren't ready to go multi-site until we get all of these things. Hopefully most of them, mostly green, yellow, but we don't want anything that's red or orange. That just indicates we aren't ready yet for multi-site.
So that exercise is a qualitative one, and it allows the team just to self-assess the critical areas of ministry health for multi-site success, honestly. What are one or two more objective ways that a church can know that they might be ready for multi-site, Tony?
Yeah, actually, a few come to mind. The first is you really do need to be a certain size church before you're prepared to send out a core of your church, a core of your leaders, your volunteers, the people contributing financially to your church. You have to be a certain size before you're ready to do that. And we recommend at a minimum 1,000 people in-person attendance. But even looking back at some of the research from recent months, on average, churches are between 1,500 and 2,000 before they launch their very first campus. So if you're experiencing growth and feeling capacity constraints, that's the reason to go multi-site. I was just trying to reflect back in the last several churches that I've been working with, including most recently Great Church up in Hendersonville, South Carolina. All of those churches that are considering going multi-site for the very first time are experiencing enough growth and health that they have 3-4 services. So they've demonstrated already over time multiplication in services. And that is it's just good preparation for when we start to begin to think about multiplying in locations as well. So 1,000 in attendance at a minimum, 1,500 to 2,000 though is the average size that we're seeing. Let's talk about the number of leaders in your church. So we think you need to have a core team, a launch team of at least 100 people. And so these aren't people that you're just saying, well, you go for the first 6 months, the first year to help us get this location off the ground. These are 100 people that live in, work in, play in the community where you're intending to go launch this location. They have to be invested in this community and willing to make this their church, essentially. They're not going in as missionaries and then intending to come back to your sending location. They're all in for the new location. Ideally, though, that core team, the launch team, should be about 200 people. And what we see then is that 200 core team will probably translate into a new campus with total of attendance double that number, about 400 people, which is good because at that point, then you probably will have enough people to financially support a basic staff team that might include a campus pastor, someone helping with kids, worship, tech, things like that. You'll be able to afford to have a certain level of staffing in that location that will allow you then to replicate who you are as a church in this new location. Mm-hmm. It's important to remember too that many of the people that are going to be going to this new campus are probably already leading at your church. And so because of that, I think many times we consider these are the number of volunteers. These are a number of volunteer leaders we need to send to the new location. So the focus is on building the teams at the new location. The reality is this is an all play, meaning your sending locations are going to have a lot of hard work ahead of them as well, because they're going to be backfilling key volunteer roles, key leadership roles, and just keeping that in mind is another. It's if you think you can pull that off, that's another indication that you're ready for multi-site. And then the last area, and I referred to this a moment ago, is really around financial costs and investment. In two areas. Number one, and the most obvious, is you have to have enough money to actually launch that new location, whatever that's going to look like, whether that's renting a facility or purchasing a facility, renovations, whatever that looks like. And then the upfront cost of building the staff team and just preparing for the ongoing ministry expenses that new location will experience. So those are the upfront launch costs. But then, as I referred to earlier, it's probably going to take about 3 years before this new location is fully financially self-sustaining, meaning that the offerings that are coming in from that new location are covering the campus expenses, including staffing. They're also covering the allocation of central ministry expenses for those central ministries that are supporting all the locations, including the new campus. And then you want every location to, at some point, be able to invest in mission expansion, whether that's launching a new multi-site campus or church planting or engaging in missions or engaging in outreach initiatives in your community. You need every location to be also financially supporting those aspects of your ministry as well. So just making sure that you're financially prepared to take this step is obviously key to knowing whether or not we're ready to launch our first multi-site location.
That's really helpful. Tony, I want to move on to the last section of our conversation today. But before I do that, any final thoughts on this one?
Yeah, Sean, I think my strong encouragement here would be just if you're going to do this on your own, I'd really encourage you to slow down and take time assessing if you're ready for multi-site. Don't let a merger opportunity put pressure on your timeline. Don't rush through this part of the process. The key is to really look at everything you need to replicate. So to really confirm you have mostly green and yellows in all 10 of those critical readiness areas, that's really important if you're going to launch a healthy, thriving multi-site location. And if you do engage with outside partners like us, we can help you move faster because we can help you confirm your readiness and answer all those questions that might be giving you pause and either confirm for you, oh, yeah, we really do need to slow down and work on this first. Or based on, all these churches that we've worked with through the years, it could be that you're kind of where Amy and I were when we were describing our anxieties about launching our very first locations at Eagle Brook and at New Spring. Some of it may just be anxiety that you've never done this before, and you actually might need an outside partner to say, no, you're ready for this. It's time. It's time for you to take this step. So just a couple things to consider as you're, as a team, trying to figure out, is now the right time or not?
All right, before we move on to the last part of our conversation, take a look at the blank readiness checkpoints exercise in your workbook. This is really an exercise that should be completed by your team, but just take a moment and reflect on it. Are there any areas in the readiness checkpoints that you are confident are currently green within your church? Currently green. I'll take about 20 to 30 seconds and do that now. Okay, let's move into our final conversation for today around the key staffing and structure decisions for multi-site. I'll draw on a couple of our other predictable outcomes just to set up this discussion. We found that picking the right location for your new campus will be more important than finding the best facility, but empowering the right leadership will be even more important than the location. Can you say more about that, Amy?
Yeah, let me jump in. That's right. A feasible facility in the right location is better than a great facility in the wrong location. But even with the optimal location and facility, if you make poor decisions about the leadership of a new campus, you can expect all those plans to go awry. For new locations, you need to identify campus leaders who have a missionary mindset, who will go into the community. We talk about this a lot in our podcast. You're looking for a leader and a team that has this builder or growth mindset rather than this teaching or shepherding mindset. That goes back to the teaching model again. Of course, we're saying we want you to look for a campus leader who won't be teaching primarily, but will be the leader of that campus when we talk about this missionary mindset. Ultimately, the campus pastor's primary responsibility in this model is connecting people at his or her location to the mission and vision of the church, and then helping all the attendees take their next steps, in their faith. So this means the campus pastor is primarily building teams and leading people. And practically that looks like getting guests connected to relationships, which are typically groups, and responsibility, which are those volunteer teams. And then beyond the campus leader, the mix of the other staff leaders you need on day one at the new campus will really depend on your multi-site model you're using and the financial plan. And Tony, as you were just talking about the size of the team you need to launch, I want to kind of bold what you said, which is having a large enough launch is going to afford you to get the staffing that you need. Almost every multi-site church that I have worked with that's come together through a merger, that church they merged with is way overstaffed. So when we're talking about a campus of 400, we're talking about 3 to 4 full-time equivalents. And at a minimum, I believe every campus needs to have a campus pastor. They need a children's pastor or director, and they need that worship and tech leadership that's happening for the weekend service. So if you launch too small or merge with a church that's too small, you're going to feel the tension immediately that we are beginning to overstaff. And the beauty of multi-site, when we talk about hiring a campus leader with a missionary mindset who's trying to raise up other leaders, most of the ministry, honestly, is done by the people of that campus. It's how we give ministry away. So it's got a great flywheel. I think when I left Eaglebrook, we staffed at 1 full-time equivalent for every 320 people, but we had 6 locations by then. But if you launch small or spread out too thin or go early, that flywheel's going to be pretty rusty and hard to move.
Tony, when we help churches with multi-site staffing and structure, some of the most pressing questions, honestly, from church leaders are around the allocation of staff, volunteers, and launch team. And we actually help them do the math. We go through an exercise to help them do the math, to help them make the decisions that will lead to long-term success. Would you mind sharing one of the tools from our process that helps them define success and the numbers of people they need for the launch team, staff size, volunteers, and their expected attendance at launch?
Yeah, hearing you say it that way, though, makes me wonder if I need to write a book someday called Ministry Math, though I'm sure only about 3 people would read it. So instead, let me show you this chart. This chart, we call our campus teams and leaders chart. And the reason why I wanted to show you this, we don't have time today to actually work through this exercise, but clearly you can see what we're trying to help churches think about is if the church is going to have an attendance of this size that is built off of a core team, of this size, the next question is, how many volunteer leaders are we going to need in order to provide all the core ministries that we need to provide at the new location? We need to define that. And then at the top, you can see defining specifically what staff are going to be required in order for us to provide our core ministries and to actually launch this location with health. With this, I won't show it, but we also have another exercise that helps to identify and prioritize the staff roles that we need to hire both at the launch of a location, but also over time. And we try to prioritize and sequence those staff roles for every new multi-site church, so they have a sense of what their staffing plan is going to look like going forward. But what I will say related to this conversation is churches often do get the math wrong if they don't follow a clear framework up front, meaning that many times churches overstaff and they under volunteer. In other words, they're so focused on what staff do we need to hire when we launch a new location. They spend very little thought and very little investment of time around building the volunteer teams and identifying the volunteer leaders that are going to be needed in order to carry out the ministry of the church. And so I would say, Sean, the biggest mistake we see is churches overstaff and hire people that are going to this new location to do the ministry themselves. You just need to remember you're only going to have a few staff members at this new location. And so the people you hire, they have to be strong at team building. They have to be strong at leader empowerment. They may have other specific roles and responsibilities, but their number one job is to build teams and empower leaders. And by the way, this isn't just about getting ministry done. When, in other words, we need to be encouraging people to engage in serving. When people commit to serving and leading volunteer teams and groups, they really do become your best marketing strategy. These volunteers and volunteer leaders, these are the people who are fully invested in the success of this location. And because of that, they will be your best evangelists to invite their friends, their family, their coworkers, their teammates to come to the grand opening of this campus. It's really the best marketing strategy that you could have to launch a new campus. And it's certainly a far better return on investment than yard signs or Facebook ads or billboards. So you have to prioritize developing this volunteer team. And like I said, Sean, we have a couple of exercises that we work through with teams to make sure the volunteer teams are strong enough, but also then that the staff team is there to support the mission of what's going to be happening in that new location.
All right, before we move on to today's live Q&A, I want to go back and just kind of review that decision that we are encouraging your church to make today. And that is to commit to reviewing the predictable outcomes you learn with your leadership team, with your senior leadership team or the leadership team you have around you before you move forward. And before we move into this live Q&A, I'm just going to give you 20 to 30 seconds. If you're sitting with your leadership team, would you just find a date on the calendar to go through and review those predictable outcomes? If you're not, if you're watching this alone, maybe just send out a quick email to your leadership team and ask about getting something on the calendar. That will help you just create an actionable step to review those predictable outcomes together. So about 20 to 30 seconds, and then we're going to come back with live Q&A. Well, Tony, Amy, really good conversation today. But we only have a few minutes left for Q&A, so we're going to go rapid fire. Does that sound okay?
Sounds good.
Yep.
Perfect.
Especially after watching myself talk for the last 45 minutes. That's awful.
Kind of over it, huh? But good conversation going on in chat. So it was great that we're able to all be in there together and have that conversation. I had a question about the 1,000 attendance mark metric that you shared. Is that total heartbeats in the building, total number of people in the building on a Sunday, or is that kind of the average main worship service attendance? How do you figure the 1,000 mark?
Yeah, yeah, a thousand people, total people, I think is a good way to look at it. Of course, you just remember when you start to build the core team of people, it's like 100 people that are not just going to go be a part of that church, attend. They have to be invested. Those 100, they
Right.
probably need to be adults and students and folks that can actually engage and be a part of that mission. So that's you can fudge a little bit on the total attendance number, a little bit higher,
Yeah.
a little bit lower. But it's going to take a core of people that are really ready to invest their time to make this successful.
Yeah.
Tony, I'll just add in there, and I've said this before, but we just had our fourth grandbaby here 2 weeks ago, so babies are on my mind. But bigger babies sleep better, they're healthier. Small babies struggle in more areas, and I think the same is true with multi-site. The bigger campus you can birth, the more likely it'll be a little bit healthier and easier to raise than if we launch too small.
There's a lot of family analogies for you two from you two in this
I
I was
was
just
webinar
inspired
today.
thinking,
by Tony.
maybe we should get out of the church business and do parenting and marriage instead. I don't know.
You both have done a great job at raising kids, so a lot of experience to speak from there. Follow up to that question: does this attendance number, does that indicator, that 1,000 mark, change in a rural setting? Is it any impact from being in a rural church on that metric?
It may look a little bit different, but even with the rural churches that we're working with that are engaging a multi-site strategy, is the bigger the core, the healthier that launch is going to be. And so, yeah, it may look a little bit different in a rural setting, but gosh, it's not going to be significantly different. If you start to talk about sending a family to a new location, that's a whole lot different than sending 50, 60, 70 people. So
Yeah.
it may look a little bit different though.
Yeah, that's a good question. Amy, from your experience, Dustin had this question. What do you think is preferable when launching a new site? A setup teardown in a school on a Sunday morning, or a Sunday afternoon service in a more established facility, church building, that sort of thing? So Sunday morning, setup teardown, Sunday afternoon in a building.
Yeah, we'll see if Tony agrees with me. I think people, when church is held, is just still pretty established in our communities. So I think optimal times probably trump more optimal facility. But as we were talking about in the chat here, when you're in a setup teardown situation, as you launch that campus, it's a great starting place. In fact, often those teams have those memories, those war stories for years of setup teardown. But you need to be thinking as you're launching in a school or some other facility, you need to be thinking about what's next. So that whole team understands we're doing this right now. We're taking this hit. We're sacrificing our time in setup and tear down, but that will wane if we don't know where we're going next, if that time gets too long. And I think I put in chat, typically there's about a 3-year window you have to kind of get people excited about that promised land location.
Yeah, that's good. One of the questions that I saw in the chat earlier, and I just wondered if you'd respond to this quickly. We don't have much time left. There was a question about how often campus pastors should preach live at their location if you're leveraging video teaching. I thought that was interesting. Your response to that?
Yeah, I would say as little as possible. And the reason why is everything we talked about. The more often the whole church can be hearing the same teacher, the better. And in fact, if one of the campus pastors is a gifted communicator, they should just be incorporated into the teaching team.
Yeah.
And when you do teaching from the broadcast location so that everybody can learn from, engage with their teaching. So my response would be as little as possible.
Can I add to that one too, Tony?
Sure.
I think another reason for that answer, I agree with Tony, is that when you're trying to have an invest and invite culture at your church, meaning I can invite my friend and it doesn't matter what time they come to church, which location they come. you need to build trust with your congregation that this is going to be a predictably excellent experience. And so if that friend finally shows up, but it's not the main teaching team, and maybe it just feels different, your longtime believers, they're going to go with who's ever teaching, but that experience, that bar might drop just a little bit and could detract people from inviting friends or family to church.
Absolutely. Yeah, makes sense. Well, that's all the time that we have for today's webinar. Thanks for tuning in and joining us. It was a great conversation. There are several questions we didn't have a chance to get to in the live Q&A today. We'll try to follow up in our content with answers to those questions. But just know our podcast, our YouTube channel, there are lots of answers to these types of questions in the content that's already out there. So if you haven't tuned in to any of our multi-site conversations in those two places, please do. Of course, we had this conversation today because there are a lot of churches right now that are growing and considering going multi-site for the first time. And that's exactly the type of thing that we help churches with. Plan a clear strategy and structure for how to do multi-site well. So if that's something we can help your church with, we'd love to. You can reach out to us at theunstuckgroup.com. Other than that, we'll see you back on a future webinar. Have a great day, everyone.